So I've got a brand new release out on SpaceDisco Records. The track is called Eternity, and I thought I'd take you through 5 different music production techniques that I use within the track. Here's a little taster of the final track. So that is out now on Tracksource, Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you listen to music, you should be able to find it. If you want to help support the channel, help support me, then definitely pick up a copy. I'll leave a link in the description below. But let's jump into the track and have a look at the piano. Now, most of my tracks start from some kind of melodic idea, whether it's a piano sample, Rhodes sample, bass, or a vocal. There's something where it all kind of starts from. And with this one, it was a piano sample that I found. And that actual piano sample, you can see here that I've actually kind of cut it up quite a bit. That's because the original piano sample was actually really slow. So if I double click into it and find it within my browser here, you can see the original sample was 85 BPM. So that's actually a jazz sample, and if you just actually drag that in, now Ableton obviously does a great job of being able to warp this and make it to the speed of your project. So if I loop this up and have a listen to this one. Now I didn't use the whole of this sample, I just used the first part of this phrase, so I'm just going to loop that bit up. Now, because these are held piano notes and it's actually a really slow sample being sped up, you can hear that kind of wavering, that kind of wobbling almost, and I didn't really like that. And you can obviously change the warping type to kind of reduce that. But I was going through all different warping types and it just wasn't working. For example, as default, I use complex, but let's try some other ones and you'll hear what I mean. Now, I wasn't keen on any of those settings. None of them really worked. I wanted the sound of that original sample, that nice kind of smooth, natural sound. So what I decided to do was actually turn warping off, but I wanted to keep that same timing. So what I actually did was actually cut it up here for every single note within here. So you can see I'm being quite rough with these cuts here. Every single note within here, and it's quite easy to see because the waveform shows you it. I just cut them up like this. So now that all those notes are cut up, if I turn warping off, I get the same timing of each one of those notes as it was in a warped way. However, each note is being played unwarped. So I get that nice natural sound. Now you can actually hear where I've actually cut up that piano sample, where all those kind of slices are, because you can hear clips on certain ones of those, kind of rough clips. Now in the final release track, those clips are still in there, but because I've got so many other elements, it kind of disguises that. However, if you do want to fix those, you can use fades. So if I go into each individual slice here, for example, I can actually just drag the fade over here, and that should fix those clippings. So I can do this with each individual slice. So I've got the first part here with fades and the second part here without fades, and you can hear the difference. You can definitely hear on those last like 3 slices where that clipping is happening. So that's kind of how you can fix that. So as you can see there, warping is not always the answer, and for samples like that, I do tend to cut them up and then keep them at the original tempo. Just gives a more natural kind of feel. Now next up, let's have a look at the bass, and I've kind of gone for a funky-ish kind of bass to go with that piano, something a bit more kind of natural. And actually the VST that I'm using is the sub on one of my favorite settings within here called Strange Thing. Now I started with a very simple bass line and started adding extra notes here and there to give it that kind of funkiness almost. Now the scale feature within Ableton is definitely your friend within here. You can see that I've actually got it set to the D sharp major scale, and actually we've got scale fold on as well. So no matter where you put a note, it's going to be within the scale. So that kind of helps you really kind of play around with it. So this is kind of how the bass line first started. So far it's quite a simple bass line, but I wanted to make it really kind of funky. And one of the techniques to be able to do that is kind of using the octaves and jumping up an octave on the upbeat. Now you can see here at the end of the bass loop, I actually have this C0, which is actually hitting on the beat. But because I have it sidechained with the kick, it's not conflicting with it. However, this is a good opportunity to put that kind of funkier upper octave in. So what I did was I put a C1 on the upbeat. Now that worked quite nicely within this, and as you can see here I also have an F0, so I could do exactly the same thing with this F0 and put an F1 on the upbeat. But this just felt a little bit too much. It felt like it was going up too high. So what I did was I took it down a little bit, and because we already had that C1 in there and it's still within the same scale, it just kind of worked. It definitely gives it a bit of funkiness towards the end of the bar, but I wanted to make this bass line feel not as repetitive. So the second time that phrase kind of plays around, I'm going to get some more of those upbeats in there. So on the second repeat of this pattern, you can see here that we have this D sharp 1. So I thought I'd put a D sharp 2 in there on the upbeat, just to make it a little bit funky. Now you can see here I have a couple of ghosted notes out. That's because I originally started by having those two D sharp 2s within there. But I wanted to give this a bit of movement because we now have 4 bass notes on the upbeat happening after each other, which makes it sound a bit too straight, hasn't got enough groove with it, so I wanted to kind of give it a bit more groove. So I split this note in 2, which actually gives me 2 D sharps, but I don't want to have 2 D sharps after each other. I thought I'd drop it down by 1 note, so it's now a C2, which is quite good because that actually goes into the C1 that's going to be playing next. And you can see it kind of leads into the next note. And also because it's on one of those 16ths, I've actually got 16th swing within here. So that's a 66% on the MPC swing. So it's kind of got that groove to it anyway. So it works quite nice. And here it is with the kick and the piano and how they work nicely together. Next up, I want to talk about the lead line that actually happens about midway through the track, and that was actually done with a free plugin. Now, this isn't a synth that I use very often, but when I'm looking for that funky lead line, honestly, it's an absolute go-to for me. It's the Yuhi Terrell N6. It's a free plugin, you can get it from their website, totally free of charge, and I created this lead line with it. Right, so let's take all the effects off so you can hear what it sounds like with all those off. So you can see here that I'm actually using the 7th mod Moog preset. And the only thing I'm really kind of changing with this is I'm actually automating the cut. If I jump into the actual notes within here, I've got this kind of arpeggiator happening here. Now I think I came up with these notes just by jamming out on the keyboard. I was literally just playing around and seeing what worked over the top of the track. But as you can see here, it's just 3 simple notes. And if you've got the scale feature turned on within your editor, then it's very simple to kind of add these. As you can see, they're just simply repeated one after the other in a kind of ARP kind of fashion. So as you could hear there, I actually have this clip looping every 4 bars, but the actual phrase within it actually loops every 3 bars. So because we have 3 notes within here, after 3 bars, it actually kind of repeats itself. And because the piano repeats itself every 2 bars, this feels like a little bit of a welcome change because it's not looping itself exactly the same way. So it's kind of a nice layer over the top. Just to give it a little bit of variation as well, I'm automating the cutoff on the filter. I've got a bit of standard Ableton reverb on there. And I wanted to make it feel quite old school, so I'm actually using the Wolf compressor. This is actually quite an expensive compressor, but I love the sound that you get from it. Then I've got the LFO tool in there, which is doing my sidechain ducking. I've got a bit of Soothe 2 in there, just fixing some of those resonant frequencies. And then just to give it a little bit more movement, I've got the auto pan in there as well. So that is the funky lead line, all done with a free synth. It's a really handy one to have around that, just in case you want that sound. Now let's talk about the kick, because I actually had some issues with the kick. I got most of the way through this track and then I realized that the kick wasn't quite working. So I used a few little techniques just to make it fit better within the mix. So this is the original kick, and when I was mixing it, I was realizing it felt a little bit too flabby. It was kind of really messing with the bass and it felt like it just wasn't quite working within the mix. It is definitely quite a deep kick. There aren't many top frequencies within there, and it's also got quite a bit of flab to it as well. It was just kind of messing a bit with that bass. So I used a few little techniques just to make it fit better within the mix. The first one is always putting a utility on the channel and putting it in mono. Your kick really doesn't need to be stereo, at least I don't think it does. It seems one of those things which is just fine being in mono, and it helps cut through the mix so much easier. Next up, I used a transient shaper. Now the one I'm actually using is by Native Instruments. It's called Transient Master, but there are so many out there. Honestly, I couldn't tell you which one was the best one to get. This is just one I've had for years and works really nicely for me. So a transient shaper will take the transients of your audio and kind of affect them, so you can actually increase or decrease the attack or the sustain. So the attack is that kind of bite at the very start. The sustain is how long that note lasts for. Now, as I say, with the kick, it was a bit too flabby. It was lasting a little bit too long. So actually I took down the sustain within here, down by about 40%, and that seemed to work just nicely. It made the note shorter and therefore kind of kicked through the mix quite well. Now, obviously with house music, the kick does want to come through quite well, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a long kick. Sometimes a short kick can work just as well. You got that same kind of weight within there. It's just taking up less time. So if you've got a bass line within there, just gives it a bit more room to kind of breathe. I also added on a little bit of attack within there, 20% worth of attack, which just gives it a little bit more kind of crunch, a little bit more kind of bite at the very start. So that's it with the transient shaper and then without. So now it's quite a shorter kick and it's got a little bit more bite to it. However, I realized that wasn't quite enough bite. I wanted something extra to get it through the mix. It's still quite a low kick within the mix. I wanted something that kind of was on the top end. So what I did was I added an extra kick. So I've got this kind of light kick over the top. This kick I picked because it didn't have as much low end, but mainly and most crucially, it had that kind of crunch on the top end. So if I get rid of this EQ, it sounds a bit like this. You got that kind of acoustic drum thing happening, not so much low end, but just to make sure I got rid of that low end, I only wanted the crunch from the very top of that kick. Not much at all, just a little bit of knocking, and that combined with the kick, the other kick that I got within there, it kind of just worked. And all of that just helped it punch through the mix. And the final technique I want to show you is something that I've already covered on this channel before. It's something I use in my tracks quite a bit, but it's one of those things I just wanted to show you in context and how it works within this track. And of course, I'm talking about the spin back. It's something I use all the time, but it works really nicely. And I want to show you how it sounds within this track. It just works so nicely at the end of the bar just to create that kind of fill. It is really dead simple to do. All you need to do is create an audio channel and also a MIDI channel. Now we don't need the MIDI channel at the moment, but I'll come back to that in a second. First thing we'll do is we'll set the input of the audio channel to be our drums. This includes all of your drums, your kick, your clap, your hats. I'll make sure the input's turned on and arm it for record. Next up, let's find a section where you got all the drums playing all together. And what I'll do is I'll hit record, and I want to be recording for maybe a few bars. There we go. So we got our drums there now. I'm going to turn the input off, and actually I'm just going to trim this up. So I've just got 2 bars worth within here. I'll consolidate that. And then next up, we'll select our MIDI channel and drag and drop it straight onto that MIDI channel within there. That'll create a sampler. Now what we need to do is actually use sampler for this. Sampler works kind of better for this. So I'm going to right click on here, simpler to sampler. There's only a couple of settings we need to change within here. The first one is to turn reverse on. So this is actually going to play the sample in reverse. The next one is we'll go to the MIDI tab here and we'll increase the pitch bend range. So by default, it's 5 semitones. Let's take it all the way up to 24 semitones. This might be a bit too much. We can always play with that a little bit later. We can get rid of this audio channel now as well. We don't need that. Now let's zoom into the place where we want this spin back to happen. And usually that'd be where all of your drums have dropped out. And in this little gap here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a MIDI note, brand new MIDI clip within here. And I'm just going to put a note on C3 and make that legato. I'm going to solo this and we can see how it sounds. Now that is basically just playing one beat of that loop. And what we want to do now is we're going to use the pitch bend to create that spin back effect. So I'm going to go back into this MIDI clip again, go into the automation tab within here and go to MIDI control and go to pitch bend. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up at the very top here, put a node in at the very top, so that's the top of here, and then put another one at the bottom here and all the way to the bottom. So basically what we're doing here is we're going from the top of the pitch bend right down to the bottom of the pitch end. So we're starting to get there. It's only a very small part of that sample, but we can change that. So I'm going to go back out of the automation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put this up an octave, the note up an octave. So as you can hear there, we're getting a slightly different effect, and you can kind of play around where that note is to kind of get a different effect. So basically, the higher the note is, the more force you're kind of giving that spin back. Let's hear that in the mix. And of course you can tweak that until you get the exact effect that you're after. So that's 5 music production techniques I used on my latest release, Eternity, out on SpaceDisco now. I like to kind of show you these techniques just in case it kind of helps you. Maybe it gives you that inspiration on a track that you're working on, or maybe you're just trying to achieve that kind of effect on your track. So yeah, hopefully this has been useful. If it has, then maybe help support the channel by giving this video a like, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stuff, and also if you want to get hold of this track, there's a link in the description down below. Right now, I'm gonna bring it back to the